Well, welcome back to Non-Toxic Environments Live this week. This is Andy Pace. It is so wonderful to be back with everybody after a summer away. It's been a very busy summer, lots of projects, lots of new and exciting events, and of course, planning for the new season of Non-Toxic Environments. Our very first guest for this season is, I can't tell you how excited I am about this because, well, we'll get into it. Brian Libby is a Portland-based architectural and design writer and critic who is a contributing writer to prestigious media outlets such as Dwell, Metropolis, Elemental Green, Architectural Digest, Architect, The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times. Boy, it goes on and on. Brian is also the architecture critic for the Portland Tribune newspaper. He joins us today to discuss the trends he has seen in healthy and sustainable home design, as Portland is known for being a hub and innovator of healthy and green living. As a contributing writer to the popular magazine Dwell, Brian has his finger on the pulse of the most creative spaces that including nature and other healthy home amenities. He shares some of his favorite articles, architects, and healthy architecture ideas with us today. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot. It's great to be here.
Well, I can't say how excited I am to be here with you today. And now I'm seeing my video all of a sudden is right up against my face. So I'm going to change that while we're talking here. In case nobody knows what I look like, this is what I look like. Brian, I've been involved in the construction industry myself for many years, and you and I were talking just off camera. I've been involved in the industry for about, over 30 years now. And I've been involved in projects firsthand, boots on the ground in the trenches, as they say. And to be able to get involved or to hear about projects, read about projects from your perspective. And I don't want to call you an outsider because you've been writing about this for years now. But to hear about it from your perspective is extremely interesting. And what I hope we'd talk about today is some of the projects you've written about, maybe some of your favorites. And then we're going to get into green and healthy design in construction, and then kind of branch out from there. Because while, of course, our listeners are those who are interested in healthy homes, healthy living, we're also interested in style, in design, and we'd love to know what the current and maybe the future trends are. So first off, let me ask, how did you get into writing about architecture and design?
Well, it's funny. I actually started out with a different ambition. I began my career as a movie critic, and I was reviewing movies for a newspaper here in Portland. And I wanted, though, to make the jump to being a full-time journalist. I was doing it on the side while I had a day job, working my way into the industry. And it so happened that my last day job was crucially for the local chapter of the American Institute of Architects. And I started getting interested more and more in architecture and realizing that it could be another avenue for me as a journalist. By that time, honestly, I was actually already getting tired of reviewing movies, just because for every really beautiful, wonderful, inspiring one, there's a lot of just kind of junk food, you could say. And I realized that architecture and movies actually have certain similarities that interested me. I call it the spectrum between idealism and pragmatism. To put it in another way, though, both feature movies and buildings, they both may start out with one or two kind of individual creative authors, like an architect or a screenwriter in the case of a movie, but then they require these teams of people and a lot of money in most cases to make them happen. And you have to make some decisions along the way. You have to learn to act on the fly a little bit, even though you do your best to plan out every move and every step, every shot of the movie, or every square inch of the house. Like sometimes you have to think on your feet and make pragmatic decisions, like what architects or builders would sometimes call value engineering. Finding a cheaper solution. And so I just find that interesting how you go on this journey, whether it's with your own home or with a $50 million Hollywood movie, how you go on this journey from something that's a really kind of personal creation and something, the work of just one or two people, going to these teams of 10 or 20 or 100 people to make it work, and how it changes along the way.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's a great analogy between a movie and a project, because one of the things I always talk about is you've got to have that director, right? That a director, that producer, somebody that has the vision. And in most cases, in our case, it's going to be the homeowner. Homeowner has that vision. They want to live in a home that's healthier for them and their family. But then, so from that point, who becomes um, the doer, who becomes what we would call the hammer on the project, right? That actually gets it taken care of. And so the in a movie, it's up to you're going to have the money involved. You're going to have obviously the direction and so forth. The In construction, it gets watered down, as you say, value engineering. You have a budget for the project. The project comes in well over budget. Somebody says, well, we can give you sort of somewhat the same vision, but it's going to change the overall aspect of the project. And then after the project is done, you look in and say, well, it didn't really meet what we were trying to achieve. And so it kind of, I don't want to say ruins a project, but it waters it down a bit. And I'm sure you see that an awful lot in writing.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And so often when it comes to houses and building projects, there can be this kind of friction between that which is the best value up front, uh, what'll get you to the finish line to get the house built without, going bankrupt or something, and that which is an investment that will save you money over time, that relates to the operation of the house. And sometimes
Definitely.
those are at odds. You've got to spend more money to save money later, and it's not always something, every homeowner or every home buyer has a kind of limit in terms of what they feel, the where they can kind of stretch no further. And so it's understandable sometimes, especially when you're trying to do everything at once.
Right. And then the differences between commercial construction and residential construction, the biggest issue is in commercial construction, you have a set of parameters. You've got this rule book, the specifications and the blueprints. For many years, I was involved in AIA and the Construction Specification Institute, and I used to write architectural specs. In residential construction, there isn't any of that. You might have a few pages of a blueprint, but then beyond that, it's the Wild West. It's whatever the builder decides based upon pricing and availability and comfort factor and all that. So again, to have the homeowner step in, or in some cases myself as a consultant step in and say, here's how it needs to be done, you get a lot of pushback from the industry because they don't like to be told what to do. In the commercial industry, they are told what to do from the get-go. In the residential, that's not the case.
Yeah, it is kind of amazing to me, in certain ways, how primitive most residential home construction is, and that we still build the overwhelming majority of our houses on site. It's true, of course, that we've seen prefabrication and modular occupy a greater segment of the market. And sometimes there are houses that wouldn't officially be called prefab or modular, but incorporate some of those same principles. And we see that not just in homes, but in the building industry with things like cross-laminated timber.
Mhm.
But those progressive things I'm talking about, like modular or mass timber, they're still just less than 10% of what's getting built. And it's really not that different how somebody is building a house today, a stick-built house made out of wood in most cases, compared to how they would have generations ago.
Right. And that is a question we get quite a bit from clients around the country is, what about the idea of doing a prefab or pre-panelized? I think my personal opinion is that is going to be the future of construction, because of the biggest issue in construction right now is labor shortage. And then the quality of that skilled labor is reducing a little bit every year. I think the pre-panelized or the prefab homes can be built as well or much better than what's done on site, but it's just a matter of getting the industry to sort of adopt that and allow it to be adopted into the industry.
Uh-huh. I'm interested in some of these hybrid ways, like a kind of, sometimes it might get called mass customization, or it might be called like a prefab that is tailored to your site. But the one thing about a kind of traditional stick-built house, a non-prefab, non-modular house is in theory, it can be tailored to that family, that client's specifications, whereas a prefab, a modular house is still a kind of speculative venture that's just for anybody. Like one thing I learned writing about commercial architecture is that it makes a big difference if it's speculative or not. Like if it's an office building just that a developer or owner is hoping to rent out to any company, or if it's tailor made for a specific company. It's just like if you're a gentleman buying a suit, like a tailored suit is always going to fit nicer than something just completely off the rack. Or if you do buy something off the rack, you at least maybe want to take it to get it altered and make it fit a little bit better. And I think it's true with buildings too. Like it's not impossible, of course, to do a speculative house or a speculative office building that possesses many great design qualities. But I just think more often than not, when you can have a house or a building tailored to people's individual needs, that's nice. And so, that's why I think some of these third ways are interesting, where you take advantage of some of the efficiencies of prefabrication, building things in a factory or even a protected warehouse in some cases, in some smaller cases. But on the other hand, like you're getting still a chance to tailor the suit a little bit.
Yeah, I love that. So it's that age old question when a customer says, well, how much more is it to build a healthy home versus a traditional home? Well, you can't really compare because you're comparing apples and oranges. Most of the healthy home projects I've been involved in around the country, they're custom projects because they are tailored to the homeowner, to the individual, to whatever health issue is happening at the time. Where a home that's built on spec and somebody buys off the open market was not built that way, so they're probably using more I don't want to say generic, but certainly not customized attributes of the home. Uh, so let me step back a little bit. You're based in Portland, and I remember Portland from years ago. I see Jay Watts is involved in on the Zoom today, and Jay is with a company called AFM Safecoat. He and I walked the show floor of the second green build conference in the country was in Portland at a hotel room or a hotel conference center, very small. It was so much fun. It was electric back in the day. What made Portland like that, one of those initial hubs of green building back in the day?
It's funny you say that. I remember going to a couple of early green build conferences too, and I began my career right as the U.S. Green Building Council's lead rating system was beginning. And you're right, there was a kind of sense of excitement that we were there witnessing the beginning of something like a transformation of the industry. But then at the same time, I remember like attending an early green build conference in Austin, Texas, and coming out feeling really excited. But I decided to at lunchtime go out and take a taxi to some tourist site. It might have been like the LBJ library or something. And I said to the taxi driver, like, oh, I've just come from a green building conference. And he said, what's green building? And it sort of, put things in perspective for me a little bit. But in terms of Portland, I think maybe it started with the fact that there was a generation that took hold here starting in the early 70s that really began to transform the city in certain ways that caught on with a lot of other cities that had to do with kind of reducing the long trend or reversing the long trend of designing for the automobile, like sort of bisecting our downtowns with large freeways and that sort of thing. And so we started. Portland was the first city to use intended funds for a freeway to actually build the nation's first light rail system. We tore out another freeway right along our riverfront and put in a park. And so it started with progressive urban planning. And then there was a kind of nice transition. Some of those same people, I think, got interested in sustainable building, in green building, maybe a decade or so later. I think it's a city of entrepreneurial possibility because it's traditionally been a cheap city, an affordable city to live in, where maybe you could. I think a lot of artists and creative people used to favor Portland because you could get away with having a part-time job and then pursue your creative, being a musician or whatever the case it was. I think so too could entrepreneurs try things here, and yet of course being on the West Coast, there's always been an interest in environmentalism. It's not completely accurate to say Oregon is a very liberal state because it's probably 52% liberal, and you, like any state, you get a lot of difference in kind of political values between the city and the non-city. But I think the state's always seen in itself having a kind of maverick spirit, being a place where first things have happened in some of those realms. Like Oregon was the first state to insist all of its coastline be public, and there's no such thing as a private beach in Oregon. And so I think I think it was the first state to start giving people 5 cents or 10 cents for returning their aluminum cans and glass bottles, that sort of thing. And so I think the green building movement in Portland kind of grew out of that in some ways. And there was a time where it felt like Portland was among the national leaders kind of early in the LEED rating system days. But there is a little bit of a feeling here that that certain areas where we used to lead, whether it's green design or bicycle infrastructure or urban planning, there's a little bit of a feeling that we're not so much of a leader like we were maybe 15 years ago. And Portland has also been one of the cities that has struggled, at least in its downtown, to come back from the pandemic, kind of maybe like San Francisco, maybe not quite as bad. But and so I would love, I so appreciate that people see that that track record in Portland of being a leader in some of these movements, whether it's mass transit or green design or urban planning. But I think the city is struggling to regain its confidence right now, and it's a little bittersweet to talk about it in a way because I think everything is kind of circular, everything is kind of cyclical, and so often crisis and opportunity are the same thing. Like I think in the last decade, kind of the last half of the 2010s, Portland became a lot less affordable and had a kind of moment of popularity for certain cultural reasons. A lot of people moving here, and then became a kind of victim of its own success a little bit. I know that's getting far from green design, but I think it speaks to the kind of idealistic city that it was. And like all cities, it eventually faces some kind of growing pains.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate that background on Portland because yes, Portland has been a leader. It's like Portland, Austin, Seattle, Pittsburgh, even here in Wisconsin are like these hubs around the country. And while it used to be thought that, well, environmental construction, green building was very politically motivated, you hit on the head, though. It has less to do with that, it has more to do with that entrepreneurial spirit, that maverick spirit, people taking matters into their own hands, individuals saying there's a better way to do this. And it's tough. I mean, when you're a city like Portland and you're used to being the innovator and all these things, and all of a sudden the rest of the country is kind of caught up to that, or they're trying to catch up to that. I mean, heavy lies the crown, right? It's very difficult to maintain that position. So, we'll see, I guess, in the next decade or two, what the next big thing to come out of Portland will be once, somebody else has a very good idea to do things. So let me ask you, getting back into construction then, you've written for so many wonderful publications. Dwell is a magazine that I think all of us know because, it's been it's been one of those mainstay publications that focused on sustainable and green in a lot of the writings over the years. Can you share maybe a story or two about some of the projects you've written about? It doesn't have to be in Dwell, of course, but some of the things that you've written about that actually caused you to say, boy, there is a better way to do things.
Yeah, yeah. Um, uh, One recent story comes to mind because of a specific material. It's not often that a material becomes the story of the house, but this was one I really enjoyed. It was a house in Carmel, California, which, if you've been there, is just a magical little small beach community where a lot of artists and writers have lived over the years. And it's got this incredible white sand on its beaches. I know there are other parts of the country that have that, certain ones in Florida and so forth. But there was this house that was kind of a glass box on the outside, maybe with some overhangs to shade it a little bit. But it had these wall panels on the inside that were rammed earth panels, and they were made using sand that was quarried from that actual site. And it was interesting to me because when I had thought about rammed earth or been introduced to rammed earth in the past, it was often a kind of an entire building or whole wall systems and stuff. And it could be sometimes a little bit aesthetically wonky. Look, I don't want to stereotype, but maybe a little hippy dippy. At least the ones I've seen.
Sure.
And these were rammed earth panels that were much more clean and clean lined, and yet they were not just evoking, but literally turning the dirt or the sand underneath the ground into a beautiful wall panel. And so I was really wowed by that. That was by a Berkeley, California firm called Field Architecture, a father and son tandem. And the other thing I love about Dwell is even though it's true, I have mostly written about projects here in Portland or Oregon or on the West Coast. I get to sometimes do stories about houses in other parts of the world, or talk to people who design them from other parts of the world. I'm doing, for example, now I'm working on a story about a house in Yucca Valley, California, so right on the edge of the Joshua Tree National Park, and it's designed by a firm in Montevideo, Uruguay, and it's for an owner who is an Italian expatriate who has relocated to the LA area, and this is her kind of vacation home in the California desert. And I was actually interviewing the architect yesterday, doing a Zoom call where he's in Uruguay and I'm in Portland. And in some ways, it was actually like a story of disappointments in that I saw his firm had done lots of prefab in Brazil and Uruguay. And I said, did you do prefab here? Well, not quite. We did some prefabricated wall systems, but it was too hard. And I said, well, you've done some passive houses in Brazil and South America in the past. Was this a passive house? Well, no, it didn't quite work out that way. But it was still a beautiful house in the desert. And what I really got a sense of talking to this guy is that they had embarked on this journey to build this house and design it in 2020, right as the pandemic was happening. And it became a kind of survival story. Like they wanted it to be as innovative or as progressively designed or as sustainable as it could, but they also just wanted to get the damn thing done. And so I think that's something else that homeowners face, like that moment or that series of moments where you're doing everything you can, but you also just want to kind of survive.
You want to survive, you want to get the job done. At some point, it becomes so stressful that you got to move on with your life. And you sometimes have to choose the lesser of many evils on a project. And I know all of our listeners will relate to this. So you're involved in a project and you have to choose between, we've got X amount of money left in the budget. Are we going to put a metal roof on the house because we love the aesthetic and we love the sustainability aspect of it? Or can we spend $30,000 less, put on a 40-year dimensional shingle, and then take some of those dollars and improve the indoor air quality of the home, because that's ultimately going to be bigger impact, positive impact for the family. These are the stress points that all of our listeners are facing. And, really kind of gets me into the conversation between green or sustainable building, and healthy. So one of the things you talked about with the project, the Carmel project, was the use of the sand, the local sand, to create these wall panel systems. We discuss this all the time on consulting calls, that, in Europe, a lot of homes, most homes are built in Europe utilizing things like stone and brick and concrete, because these are the elements that are found in that part of the world. Here in North America, what do we have of an abundance of? Trees. And so wood has been the mainstay of construction since, Jamestown in the 1600s. And if you go into one of those houses that were built in the 1600s, well, you can't actually go in them. They'll let you look at them from the outside because they're too unsafe to walk into. Yet the last time I was in Italy, I stayed in a villa that was built in the 1400s, and it's still operating as a hotel today because it was made from stone and concrete and brick. So, long story short, how do we get from building with materials that are designed to fail to designing and building with materials that are designed to last, and then also bring that price point down? I mean, you must see this in your projects. You talked about mass timber, which is a newer method of constructing structural buildings, but utilizing wood, but it's designed to last a long period of time. How do we get to change this mindset?
That's a lot of good. That's a good question, or a lot of things you've touched upon there. Uh, on one hand, I do love the idea of retaining some kind of regionalism, and
Mhm.
building your house out of what people have built their houses out of there, and being part of a local vernacular. And so, in the U.S., you're right, we have a lot of wood, and where I am in Oregon in the Pacific Northwest, we really have a lot of wood. And yet, when you go to some of those places you mentioned, like Italy, Europe, and you see really old houses that have stood there for hundreds of years, for generations, you realize there are different kinds of sustainability. Like, a house that just lasts and lasts and lasts, it is and has a kind of durability where, that means multiple generations that don't need to rebuild something. Like, that's in a way like the most sustainable house you ever build is the one you don't build from scratch.
Right.
Uh, and so, renovating an old house that can be renovated and adapted over time is a way the most sustainable kind of house. And yet, in a way, like wood, even though it might not last as long as a stone or masonry house, is much more sustainable in a different way, in a couple of different ways. One, as you know, whether it's mass timber, like cross-laminated timber, or traditional stick built, of course, wood sequesters carbon. And that's one of the reasons that mass timber is taking off, other than the fact that it can do more things structurally than traditional wood construction is that, in a sense, like, the world needs to build even more out of wood just to produce less concrete and steel that are so carbon intensive in their production. There are um, uh, all these different ways you can look at it, I guess.
Mhm.
And I think each homeowner has to kind of weigh what feels right for them, and um, decide what your emphasis points are. Are you creating a kind of machine that will operate as efficiently as possible and save you as much as possible on your utility bills, or are you really thinking first about things like indoor air quality, or do you want to do your part as a kind of citizen in a time where climate change seems to become all the more undeniable every day. And so it's not to say that you have to choose between those things, but there's a lot of different ways to look at it, I guess. It's an interesting question to consider wood as being detrimental for its durability in that way. I think the other thing we're starting to think about here in the Pacific Northwest is traditionally, we've thought of California as a seismically active zone, and the Northwest as not being seismically active. But research has shown that that's not exactly true. That we have fewer earthquakes, but when we have them, we have really big ones. And
Hmm.
apparently, the Pacific Northwest is quite overdue for the size of earthquake that has been recorded in ancient times here, but is overdue now, and is predicted to be, basically they're saying the Pacific Northwest is going to get the biggest earthquake in American history.
Oh,
And so our seismic codes are kind of rapidly or somewhat rapidly changing. And one of the things I've learned over time is that wood construction has good seismic properties, that
mhm,
wood can essentially bend a little bit.
right.
And so I've become interested in its resilience in that way as well. And I don't know. It's a good question. Are there wood buildings that are 1,000 years old? Like, it's an interesting question. I remember going to a lecture one time about uh, architecture by a Japanese architect, and he actually used like a wood building and a stone building to make a point about time. He said in the West we think of time as linear, as one straight line, and in the East they think of time as circular, and so like everything comes back. And he said
Sure.
that's why in the West the ultimate architectural symbol is the Acropolis, which is allowed to kind of decay naturally over time. And in the East, it's the Ise Shrine in Japan, which they actually rebuild in a kind of ritual way exactly every 20 years. And
Hmm.
so after about 18 years, you'll start to see the new one rising next door to the old one. And they burn down their shrine, their temple every 20 years. So
Wow.
I hope that's not getting too off topic,
No,
but
that's great. I mean, in my head, I'm thinking of, and this is very, very, not a good comparison, but I think of the Mitchell Corn Palace, in Mitchell, South Dakota, where they're building those walls out of corn cobs, what's every couple of years or something like that. So, but it really is an interesting conversation, though, to talk about. I love the concept of using locally produced materials. That's why we use wood here. That's why they use stone there. That's why that sand and Carmel is used to create those walls. It makes a lot of sense because overall it's less detrimental to the environment. It should, in the long run, if everybody adopted this mentality, it should start to reduce costs, improve local economies, all those good things. But it brings the larger question, which is there's so many different ways to look at this, and there is no right way. It's really individual. And I think what the industry has done over the last 20 years is sort of painted everything with the same broad brush, and so for instance in our company we do a lot of material sales of paints and finishes and flooring materials, and they all have to meet certain codes for chemical emissions. Why do they have to meet these codes for chemical emissions? Because of the outdoor air pollution regulations. Well, you think, well, that's kind of funny. Why, if we're using paint inside of our house, why does an outdoor air pollution regulation have anything to do with the paint inside of my house? Well, because that's what the government says. That's what the EPA says, that it's possible that the chemicals that could emit from that paint could rise all the way up to the atmosphere, react with nitrogen and UV, and create smog. Okay, that's important. I understand that. Completely agree with that concept. However, inside of the home, that has nothing to do with the health of the occupant. The toxicity of those ingredients has everything to do with the health. So why don't we regulate that? Well, because the government doesn't do that. So, we have to have these discussions and decide, are we going to let just a mass feeling of how we're supposed to be doing things based upon governmental regulations take care of how we design and build our homes? Are we going to actually use our own common sense and say maybe we should do things like Portland? Maybe we should actually have some entrepreneurial spirit and be a maverick and say we're going to do things based upon how it affects our family, our neighbors, our direct local community, because ultimately that is sustainable.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's a uh, I think one of the things I learned, at the beginning, I was talking about being a movie critic before I wrote about architecture, and I was just speaking also to a class at a university last week about this, how um, everything is a kind of narrative in a way. Maybe that seems more true to me that because I'm a writer, but I think of the decisions you make as a homeowner or as someone who is going to renovate your house or anything like that as being kind of like writing your own story, and you have to decide what the emphasis points are, and you also that I describe it as a narrative, and that like you know like I remember Joseph Campbell has been cited many times, like, and was a big influence on George Lucas because he talked about like the hero's journey and how all these cultures around the world have very similar kind of folk tales and legends, and when you go on the especially as a homeowner building a home, you it's like this obstacle course, and you mentioned government regulation. That's definitely one of the obstacles, especially like here in Portland. I don't know how much this plagues other cities, but people sometimes are just beside themselves at the permitting process, like just feeling like, it just doesn't make any sense that they should have to sit there and wait for months. And so I think that the hoops you have to jump through, or the sort of stoplights you have to wait at as a homeowner, dealing with government can be so frustrating, and it's just part of it's just one obstacle in the course.
Right.
But and then you're of course being kind of shackled in a way by cost options, and everything is just so expensive. And we saw, in the pandemic, all kinds of crazy issues with supply chains, and things being, affordable 1 minute, and prices skyrocketing the most. And so all of these factors are so fluid and volatile as well. But it's so basic, like I actually became a homeowner for the first time in 2021, like as we were coming out of the pandemic, and it felt like a scary thing to do, because life was still so uncertain in many ways, not just in terms of COVID itself, but all the economic ripples that were happening. But everybody told me, you won't regret taking the plunge, and that has proven to absolutely be true. Like I can't imagine being in my apartment anymore. It's like I feel like this home has become like almost like a kind of person that is part of my family or something. Like if I were gonna make some massive life change, like I would think about, my house just like I do, like, my partner or my cat or anything
Hmm.
like that, other things that my family, my extended family. And so, it's a long journey that you go on, and you have to, the thing I have learned as a writer writing about architecture and other projects is, like, you have to want it bad. Um, but then at the same time, you have to sort of, um, reel in your own enthusiasm in other ways, that and keep a clear head. You alluded to this, like it's easy to get sort of seduced by some kind of individual material, whether it's like your quartz countertops in a kind of aesthetic way, or the metal roof you described in a kind of functional way. And so I think it almost also must be hard, just like how fast it has to happen. Like you wait and wait for years to embark on this, and suddenly you've got to make like all these decisions at once, um, and they're all interconnected. Um, and so, I think it's really hard just to be thoughtful, when you're going through that kind of gauntlet. But you're essentially writing your own story. I think as a writer, that's what occurs to me time and time again. And the buildings we love, whether it's an art museum or somebody's house, like they have a kind of clarity as an idea or as a story, like as much as anything. And you like I said, you have to want it bad, but you have to have a sense of restraint. Not just about being seduced by individual materials, but also, realizing that you're not going to get everything that you want. And even if you think and even if you do get everything you want, it's natural to always be wanting. And so you have to kind of know that about yourself, that you're going to have to, in some ways, like the most important decisions are the things you say no to. Like, do you say no to the right things?
Right. So I find that, through in the industry, there's always these trends that are occurring, and the trend for the last dozen years or so that I've seen is this trend to sort of bring the outdoors inside. And the outdoors inside meaning we want more natural light, bigger windows, more energy efficient windows. We want better indoor air quality. We want it to feel like as if inside of your home you're not stuck in this box, right? The materials, there's more natural materials being used, wood floors, there's more stone, there's more things that just kind of give you that feeling of being outside. But now, on top of that, the latest trend is, and this is specifically because of interest rates and the cost of property, that people are not looking at homes as this something I'm going to be in for 3 or 4 years and then move on to the next one. My clients are changing rapidly to, we're going to be in this home for a while. And so the home we buy may not be perfect, but we can always get there. Maybe down the road, we're going to remodel this and do this and fix this up. But what they're looking for is basically a home with good bones. It's got, a good structure to it. There's not a mold problem existing. There's issues they don't have to take care of right away. Also, because of the younger generation now that's starting to get into the home buying, they don't want to have to do a lot of these repairs and updates because maybe they just don't have the time for it. They don't have the skill level they think in order to do that. They don't have the time to learn, whatever the case is. And it's very expensive right now to hire contractors. So there's all these factors. So I see those two things as the biggest trends in construction, the bringing the outdoors in still, and then the trend of let's just buy something that has good bones to it and we'll do something down the road.
I actually like that idea, that if that's true, that people are maybe a little bit less inclined to switch to a different house in 3 or 4 years. That is good for the real estate market and it's good for the economy. But I think in some ways I still feel a little bit snake bitten, or always keeping in my mind what happened in the kind of mid 2000s with the Great Recession, and how in those days, kind of in the boom uh, before the bust. I remember becoming more and more aware of people who were kind of house flipping for a living, and maybe what you're talking about is a little bit different. Maybe what you're talking about is just being fluid with you and your family's needs, and those needs change over time, and so 3 or 4 years is not unreasonable in that way. But I think because sometimes I've seen both residential and commercial real estate uh, be first emboldened by it, but then fall victim to speculation in a way that drives up the costs for everybody else. That kind of like Holland tulip thing, where like speculation, I think is. I think of I started out as an economics major in college, and I'm always interested in this idea of what these different moves do for the economy, and how the economy is a kind of like campfire that is dangerous to get too low a fire, or too out of control a fire. And
Mhm.
I know that's not what you're talking about necessarily, but I think it's encouraging the idea of people wanting to do a kind of more long-term hold on a house. And I love the idea of younger couples, going in and finding houses that need a little TLC. It is true that when you're young, maybe you don't want to you don't want to be overwhelmed by all the fixing up you have to do. But the bones are often better in these older houses. You're inheriting oak floors instead of fake oak floors, or
Mhm.
that's a stereotype, of course. But I think it's exciting to think of people, kind of like the REM song goes, like stand in the place where you, or whatever
Where
the
you
case.
live.
Yeah, I think that's exciting. Like here in Portland, um, when it was the biggest boom, also we were starting to see a fair amount of older homes torn down by developers, and kind of larger spec houses built and put up for sale in their place. And I remember oftentimes thinking, like, I can see that little house that you tore down was too small and it needed some work, but it just seemed kind of unsustainable, and also like not what like a young family would have chosen to do. It's kind of wasteful, and so I like the idea of homeowners who are there to really do a deep dive or get involved in a long relationship with their house. I guess I'm lucky in that most of the places I've lived for many years. Like, the house I grew up in, I was in for at least 15 years. And even the apartment I was in before this house, I was in for 17 years. And so, I like the idea of developing a relationship with a house over time or a building over time and that place where you live over time. I don't mean to over romanticize it. And of course, there are people for whom buying a new house in a few years is the right move. But I like that idea of putting down deeper roots.
Well, I think that plays to that conversation we had earlier about the kind of the differences between how homes or communities are built in Europe versus in the United States. I mean, here in the United States, still 95% of the country is flyover country, and so you take an airplane from New York to Los Angeles and you see really nothing but green until you hit the cities, right? In Europe, I mean, you are if you drove 5-hour radius around, one city, you could get into 12 different countries. And so, I mean, they're packed together. And so there's no room to build new. They're just building either on top of the existing foundation, or they just continue to live into those spaces that they built 400 years ago. So, that's one of those things that we'll learn over time. We're still a very young country, but there's something to be said about buying something that has had roots, and then you can continue that. And so it'll be interesting to see how the new ways of construction, whether it's, 3D printed homes or insulated concrete form, all these new technologies will not maybe kind of help us on that goal of building these homes that will last for generations, as opposed to the throwaway society that we're used to.
And it's there's two sides to every coin too, because I actually was just thinking of a couple of friends I have in England who would kind of laugh or push back on the idea of how great their 500-year-old house is. Like, I remember staying with these friends in London, and I was sleeping on their floor, like in a sleeping bag, and it was like a wood floor. And I noticed that there was a little bit of gap between some of the floorboards, and I was able to look down between the floorboards, and I could just see dirt. Um, I was astonished. Like and so like I think like they would say like like, what are you talking about? Like, you Americans are the ones who specialize in building a house from scratch and filling it with lots of air conditioning and everything and creature comforts and giant great rooms and so you make a great point. We are lucky in the space we have here in America, and the opportunity we have to build from scratch on our suburban edges if we want to. It is true that there are issues of sprawl and waste, but it's a privilege we have as well, that we have all this land and this space, like and so I may be someone who likes old houses in the center of the city, but I love the wide tapestry that we have in our country that a lot of Europeans in some ways are envious of. The fact that I can get in my car in Portland and drive for like a half hour and be in a forest. You can't do that in Europe, in most places. And so, I think it's true as well with sort of following your dream and going to the edge, going to a small town or an urban area. I think that's actually one of the other interesting residential trends, is actually kind of a real estate trend now. Like, there was a kind of genie that we let out of the bottle with regard during the pandemic with regard to Zoom and video conferencing like we're using now. And even though a lot of offices are calling those employees back to the office now, at the same time, we won't ever be able to put the genie completely back in the bottle. And so it's going to be a lot more practical from a kind of jobs perspective to go to some of these places and build a house where you might not have felt able to in the past. I think like even though there's a lot of media reports now about certain American big city downtowns struggling, like San Francisco is maybe the poster child, but it's rough here in Portland still too, and Seattle. But what I think often gets failed to be mentioned is how big city downtowns loss is kind of the gain of small towns
Hmm.
and even neighborhoods as well. And so I think there's a lot of people who are considering building a house in some kind of small town or less urban location, and if they can solve some of the issues of getting a general contractor and getting the supplies they need there, people are able to do their jobs from anywhere they want more than ever. My sister is the politics editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, and she lives in San Diego. So like that's not a green home or healthy home issue, but I think it's worth noting that we're living in a time where it's more possible than ever to build a house in a place you want, even if your job isn't there.
Right. Yeah, totally agree with that point. I found that anybody involved in the real estate industry in the last few years, you can just see based upon land purchases alone, where all of a sudden now I live in one county west of Milwaukee, and my county, Waukesha County, land goes up for sale and it's gone. I mean, relatively quickly, and that happened even faster during the pandemic because families were like, well, all right, the schools are closed. We're now working from home. Everybody's working in the house. You can't go anywhere. The restaurants won't allow you in. All this stuff. Can we get out in the country where people are spread out far enough where they just don't really care as much about that, and get away from some of these really over the top regulations and so forth? So land grab was fast. And I don't see that changing because now that we've got a taste of it, it's like, well, I can see this sprawl happening even faster. Boy, I could talk with you all day long. This has been wonderful. And I know we didn't talk as much about the whole green and healthy aspects of things, but it was really a fascinating discussion. I love your perspective, and I really hope at some point I can have you back on and talk about some specific projects.
Oh, anytime. It's a pleasure. And I hope I didn't ramble too much about
Mhm.
non-green stuff. But, I think it's an exciting time for sustainable home construction, whether it's prefab or indoor air quality. Health, like we talked about at the beginning, is becoming more of a factor, not just energy efficiency and saving money on your power bills. Indoor, outdoor, there's a lot of interesting trends going on. And, I think it's an exciting time to be a homeowner.
Fabulous. Brian Libby, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure.
All right, take care.
You too.